Hello there, how are you tonight? Tired, restless, mildly annoyed by your pillow's betrayal? Well, you've come to the right place. Because tonight, we're diving into a story so boring, so soothingly slow, so delightfully dusty. It might just lull your brain into a nap before we even reach the first camel. This is not your average history lesson. This is boring history for sleepwear. The facts are real. The tone is irreverent, and the pacing is slower than a goat deciding whether to move. Our topic, the Bedouins, nomads of the desert, masters of survival, and possibly the inventors of the original chill lifestyle, long before hammocks and iced coffee were a thing. We'll explore how they endured heat that could fry an egg on a rock, and probably did, how they built homes out of goat hair and stubbornness, and how they managed to look majestic while riding camels that clearly had attitude problems. So, fluff your pillow, dim the lights, and prepare to be gently bored into blissful slumber by tales of sand, shade, and the surprisingly strategic art of doing absolutely nothing in the desert. Let's begin. Let's start with the obvious. The desert was hot. Not beach day hot. Not forgot to wear deodorant hot. We're talking the sun is personally offended by your existence hot. The Bedouins, nomadic tribes of the Middle East and North Africa, looked at this scorched landscape and said, "Sure, we'll live here." And somehow they did, gracefully, majestically, and with camels that looked perpetually unimpressed. Camels, by the way, are the desert's version of a sarcastic roommate. They carry your stuff, they store water, they make faces that say, "I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed." Bedouins didn't just ride camels, they bonded with them. They knew which ones were moody, which ones were secretly plotting escape, and which ones could be bribed with dates. Not romantic dates, actual dates, the fruit. But before the camels, before the tents, before the poetry under the stars, there was the sand. And the sand was everywhere. It got in your shoes, your food, your soul. It was the original exfoliant, whether you wanted it or not. Yet the Bedouins didn't fight the desert. They befriended it. They moved with it. They rested when it was angry. They traveled when it was sleepy. They treated shade like royalty and silence like a trusted advisor. Their lives were slow, deliberate, rhythmic. They didn't rush me, 'cause rushing in the desert is how you end up sweaty, dizzy, and regretting all your life choices. So yes, the sand was hot. The camels were grumpy. But the Bedouins, they were cool. Not in the temperature sense, but in the "I know how to survive this and still look majestic" sense. And that, dear listener, is where our story begins. The desert, if it had a personality, would be that one neighbor who never smiles, never waters their plants, and always seems vaguely annoyed that you exist. It wasn't just unfriendly, it was downright hostile. Scorching sun, no shade, sandstorms that showed up uninvited like drama-loving relatives, and temperatures that made you question whether your skin was supposed to feel like toast. Most people took one look and said, "Nope." But the Bedouins, they said, "Challenge accepted." You see, the desert didn't want company. It was the original introvert. It had no rivers, no forests, no cozy little just sand and rocks, and the occasional lizard who looked like it had seen things. But the Bedouins weren't just visitors. They were survival artists. They didn't try to change the desert. They adapted to it. They learned its moods, its rhythms, its passive-aggressive weather patterns. They knew when to move and when to stay still, when to chase a cloud for shade and when to sit quietly and wait for the wind to stop yelling. They built homes that could be packed up in minutes. They wore clothes that turned them into walking shade structures, and they developed a lifestyle that was basically one long strategic nap. The desert tried to scare them off. It threw heat, sand, and silence at them. But the Bedouins didn't flinch. They just squinted, adjusted their headscarves, and kept walking. Because when you live in a place that wants you gone, you learn to be clever. You learn to be patient. And you learn that sometimes the best way to survive is to move slowly, drink tea, and pretend the sandstorm is just a very aggressive spa treatment. So yes, the desert wanted everyone to leave, but the Bedouins stayed. And in doing so, they turned one of the harshest places on earth into a home. A quiet, dusty, camel-filled home. Let's talk about tents. Not the kind you wrestle with on a weekend camping trip. Not the kind that collapses in the wind while your marshmallows burn. We're talking Bedouin, tents crafted from goat hair, woven with patience, and designed to survive the kind of heat that makes your eyebrows reconsider their existence. These tents weren't just shelters, they were statements. They said, yes, I live in the desert. Yes, I'm majestic. And yes, my house can be packed up faster than your suitcase. Bedouin tents were open plan long before it was trendy. No walls, no doors, just flaps, breeze, and the occasional goat wandering through like it owned the place. The material, goat hair. Because, apparently, goats are not just judgmental, they're also incredibly useful. Their hair, when woven tightly, creates a fabric that's breathable, durable, and magically cooler inside than the blazing inferno outside. During the day, the tent offered shade. At night, it held warmth. And in between, it served as a living room, bedroom, kitchen, and gossip hub. Inside, life was simple. There were rugs, cushions, and maybe a kettle bubbling quietly over a fire. There was storytelling, tea sipping, and the occasional dramatic sigh from a camel parked just outside. Privacy, not really a thing. But in the desert, you didn't need walls. You needed trust, rhythm, and a good sense of humor. When the wind blew sand into your soup, and when it was time to move, the tent could be packed up in minutes, rolled, loaded onto a camel, and carried to the next patch of shade like a portable lifestyle. So yes, Bedouin tent life was minimalist, but it was also brilliant. A home that breathed with the desert. A space that welcomed stars, stories, and the occasional goat interruption. And honestly, it was probably more peaceful than your average apartment building. If you've ever tried assembling furniture with instructions written in ancient hieroglyphics, you'll appreciate the Bedouin approach to home building. No screws, no stress, and absolutely no Allen wrench. Their secret, goat hair and optimism. Mostly goat hair. You see, Bedouins didn't have lumber yards or hardware stores. They had goats. And goats, while occasionally rude, provided the perfect material for desert architecture. The hair was collected, cleaned, and spun into long threads, then woven into panels that could be stitched together to form a tent. It was breathable, flexible, and here's the magic part: it responded to weather. When it rained, rare but dramatic, the goat hair swelled and sealed the fabric, keeping the inside dry. When it was dry, which was always, it stayed porous, letting air flow through like nature's air conditioning. It was like living inside a mood ring made of livestock. The construction process was simple. Find a flat patch of sand, unroll your goat hair panels, prop them up with wooden poles scavenged from places that probably didn't want to give them up. Tie everything down with ropes, rocks, and sheer determination. No blueprints, no zoning laws, just instinct, tradition, and a deep understanding of how to make a home that could survive a sandstorm and still look elegant. Inside, the tent was divided by rugs and cushions. There was a cooking area, a sleeping area, and a storytelling zone where dramatic tales were told with the flair of a soap opera and the pacing of a camel on a lazy day. And when it was time to move, the whole thing could be packed up in under an hour, loaded onto camels, carried across the desert, and reassembled like a pop-up oasis. So yes, the Bedouins built their homes out of goat hair, but they also built them out of wisdom, patience, and the kind of optimism that says, sure, the sun is trying to kill me, but at least my tent looks fabulous. If the desert had a royal court, camels would be the reluctant monarchs and goats would be the scheming advisors. Together, they formed the backbone of Bedouin life and the occasional source of drama that made tent gossip truly sparkle. Let's start with camels, majestic, grumpy, built like furry tanks with attitude problems. Camels weren't just transportation, they were status symbols, water reservoirs, and emotional support animals. If your idea of emotional support includes being stared at, like UVA disappointed them personally. They could go days without water, carry heavy loads, and walk across scorching sand like it was a red carpet. But they also had opinions, loud ones. They groaned, snorted, and occasionally refused to move unless bribed with dates or flattered with compliments. Bedouins knew their camels like you know your favorite pair of socks. Which ones were fast, which ones were stubborn, which ones had a flair for dramatic pauses mid-journey just to remind everyone who was really in charge. Then there were the goats, smaller, sneakier, and somehow always involved in minor scandals. Goats provided milk, meat, and the aforementioned hair for tents. But they also had a knack for escaping, climbing things they shouldn't, and staring at you like they were planning a coup. Goat politics were real. There were leaders, followers, and that one goat who refused to play by the rules. Bedouins watched their herds like soap operas, tracking alliances, rivalries, and the occasional dramatic headbutt. Livestock wasn't just livelihood, it was culture, it was economy, it was entertainment. And in a place where the sand never changed and the sun never quit, a camel's mood swing or a goat's rebellion was the kind of excitement that kept life interesting. So yes, Bedouin survival depended on animals, but it also depended on understanding them, respecting them, and occasionally laughing at their antics while sipping tea and pretending not to be covered in fur. In the modern world, doing nothing is often frowned upon. You're expected to hustle, grind, multitask, and pretend you enjoy it. But in the desert, doing nothing was a survival strategy, and the Bedouins were absolute professionals. Let's be clear, this wasn't lazy, this was strategic stillness. Because when the sun is trying to roast you like a forgotten marshmallow, movement is not bravery, it's foolishness. Bedouins mastered the rhythm of the desert. They knew when to walk, when to rest, and when to lie perfectly still and let the heat pass like an angry guest who'll eventually leave if you ignore it long enough. Midday was sacred, not for productivity, but for shade, silence, and the occasional nap so deep it could be mistaken for meditation. They didn't rush, they didn't panic. They paced themselves like the desert itself, slow, deliberate, and slightly mysterious. A typical day might include waking up early, before the sun starts yelling, packing up camp with the efficiency of someone who's done it 1,000 times, traveling slowly, like a camel with nowhere urgent to be, resting under a tree that looks like it's also trying to quit. Drinking tea so slowly it becomes a spiritual experience. Telling stories that stretch time like warm dough. Even conversations were paced. No one interrupted. No one rushed the punchline. It was storytelling as a form of breathing. And when the heat peaked, everyone stopped. Humans, camels, goats. It was a collective agreement. Let's not. Doing nothing wasn't just restful. It was wise. It conserved energy. It preserved sanity. And it turned the desert from a threat into a companion. So yes, the Bedouins did nothing. But they did it with purpose, with grace, and with the kind of quiet dignity that says, I could move right now, but I won't, and that's okay. If the desert had a mood swing, it would be called a sandstorm. One moment, everything's calm. The next, the wind decides to throw a tantrum and redecorate the landscape with sand. Lots of sand, in your eyes, your ears, your soup, and your soul. To outsiders, sandstorms are terrifying. To Bedouins, they're just mildly annoying. Like a fly buzzing around your tea or a camel refusing to cooperate. The trick wasn't to fight the storm, it was to outwait it. Bedouins didn't chase shelter, they became shelter. They wrapped their faces in cloth, turned their backs to the wind, and sat quietly while the desert had its dramatic moment. Their tents, made of goat hair and stubbornness, held firm. Their camels hunkered down like furry statues, and the goats, well, the goats usually panicked, ran in circles, and then pretended they meant to do that. Inside the tent, life continued. Tea was poured, stories were told, and someone inevitably said, "It's just a breeze," while brushing sand out of their eyebrows. Sandstorms weren't just weather, they were part of the rhythm. They came, they went, and they left everything slightly rearranged, like nature's version of spring cleaning, but with more grit and less consent. Bedouins didn't complain, they adapted. They knew how to seal the tent flaps, how to protect the fire, and how to keep the goats from staging a coup during the chaos. And when the storm passed, they emerged, dusted themselves off, and carried on like nothing happened. Because in the desert, resilience wasn't a choice, it was a lifestyle. So yes, sandstorms were inconvenient, but they were also predictable, manageable, and occasionally dramatic enough to inspire a poem. In the desert, news didn't travel fast. It wandered, it meandered. It stopped for tea, got retold 3 different ways, and arrived slightly exaggerated, but far more entertaining. Welcome to the Bedouin tent flap, the original social media. No Wi-Fi, just people, cushions, and stories that grew more dramatic with every retelling. Bedouin life may have been minimalist, but their conversations were anything but. Every visitor brought tales, every neighbor had updates, and every goat incident was worthy of a full retelling, complete with sound effects and scandalous pauses. The tent was the stage, the storyteller was the star, and the audience, wide-eyed, tea-sipping, and ready to gasp at the twist ending if they'd heard it before. Topics included: who lost a camel and blamed the wind? Which goat escaped and joined another tribe? Who made the best yogurt this season, a surprisingly competitive category? And, of course, romantic rumors involving someone's cousin's cousin and a mysterious traveler with unusually nice sandals. Stories weren't just entertainment. They were memory. They were history. They were how Bedouins passed down wisdom, warnings, and the occasional joke about camel flatulence. And the best part, everyone participated. Even the quietest elder had a tale. Even the youngest child had a question. Even the camel outside seemed to lean in, pretending not to listen. The tent flap was more than fabric. It was a portal, a place where the outside world came in, and the inside world stretched out into legend. So yes, the desert was quiet, but the tents, they buzzed with stories, with laughter, with the kind of gossip that made you forget the heat and lean a little closer. In the desert, there are no road signs, no glowing billboards, no polite voice saying, in 300 meters, turn left at the cactus. There's just sand, and more sand, and the occasional rock that looks suspiciously like the last rock. So how did the Bedouins find their way? With stars, with memory, and with a healthy dose of sarcasm. Bedouin navigation was an art form. They didn't use maps, they were the maps. Every dune, every ridge, every oddly shaped shrub was a landmark. And if you asked for directions, you'd get something like, go past the place where the goat fell last spring, then turn right at the wind. Helpful, not really, but somehow it worked. They read the stars like bedtime stories. The night sky wasn't just beautiful, it was practical. Constellations pointed the way. The moon gave clues. And if the stars were hiding, well, that's when you asked Yusuf. Yusuf was the guy who always claimed to know a shortcut. He didn't, but he said it with confidence, and that's half the battle. Bedouins also used oral maps, stories passed down through generations that described routes, dangers, and places where the tea was especially good. These tales were layered with metaphor, humor, and the occasional exaggeration, like, beware the valley of the whispering wind, which really meant it's windy and your tent will probably fly away. Travel was slow, deliberate, and filled with pauses for tea, camel negotiations, and philosophical debates about whether that dune looked familiar or was just pretending. And if you got lost, you didn't panic. You sat down, you waited, and eventually someone would wander by and say, you're not from around here, are you? So yes, Bedouins navigated with stars, but they also navigated with stories, with memory, with humor, and with the kind of calm confidence that says, we'll get there, eventually. The desert is not known for its buffet options. There's no all-you-can-eat sign flapping in the wind. No waiter asking, would you like your sand medium or well done? But the Bedouins, they made it work, with dates, with dairy, and with a culinary creativity that bordered on wizardry. Let's start with dates. Nature's candy, sticky, sweet, and suspiciously filling. 1 date could power a camel ride. 3 dates, and you were basically unstoppable. 10 dates, and you were just showing off. They were eaten fresh, dried, mashed, fermented, and occasionally weaponized in sibling arguments. Then came dairy, camel milk, goat milk, sheep milk. If it had hooves and a bad attitude, it probably got milked. Camel milk was the MVP, and slightly salty, like the camel's personality. It was turned into yogurt, butter, and a mysterious substance called desert cheese, which tasted like hope and regret. Meat was rare, not because they didn't like it, because they liked their animals alive. Slaughtering a camel was like selling your Wi-Fi router, technically possible, but deeply inconvenient. So meals were simple. Flatbread baked on hot stones, rice if you were lucky, spices if you were really lucky, and tea, always tea, boiled until strong enough to wake the dead, then sweetened until it could lull them back to sleep. Recipes were passed down orally, often with vague instructions like, add enough salt to make your ancestors proud, or cook until the sun looks tired. And yet, somehow, it worked. The food was nourishing, comforting, and occasionally surprising. Like the time someone added fermented camel yogurt to everything and called it fusion. So yes, the desert diet was minimal, but it was mighty. It sustained travelers, poets, and the occasional lost merchant who mistook a sand dune for a tavern. And if you ever find yourself in the desert, hungry and confused, just remember, dates are your friend, camel milk is your frenemy, and tea is your destiny. You might think the desert is no place for glamour, too much sun, too much sand, too many camels judging your outfit. But the Bedouins, they were effortlessly fabulous. Even in 40 degrees Celsius heat and 0 humidity, they managed to look like they'd just stepped out of a Vogue shootif. Vogue were edited by a goat. Let's start with Cole. That dramatic black eyeliner wasn't just for style. It protected the eyes from sun glare and sand. It also made you look like you knew secrets, ancient secrets, like where the good dates were hidden. Men wore it, women wore it, even toddlers sometimes rocked a smoky eye. Because in the desert, you don't just survive smolder. Then there were sand baths. No water, no problem. Just bury yourself in warm sand and let nature exfoliate your regrets. It was like a spa treatment, but with more lizards. Hair care was minimal but majestic. Oils from olives, dates, and mysterious desert plants kept hair shiny and camel-resistant. Braids were common. So were headscarves, both practical and fashion-forward. Because nothing says I'm thriving like matching your scarf to the sunset. Clothing was loose, layered, and surprisingly chic. Flowing robes, embroidered details, and enough fabric to start your own tent if needed. It kept you cool, protected your skin, and gave you that windswept philosopher look. Perfume, absolutely, made from flowers, herbs, and whatever smelled better than camel. Applied generously, especially before social gatherings or dramatic exits. And let's not forget posture. Bedouins carried themselves with the kind of grace that comes from knowing you can survive a sandstorm and still look good doing it. Even when riding a camel sideways, they had poise. So yes, Bedouin beauty was practical, but it was also powerful. It said, I may be covered in dust, but I'm still dazzling. And if you ever find yourself in a desert storm, remember, apply coal, strike a pose, and let the wind do the rest. In the desert, shouting doesn't work. The wind steals your words. The camels ignore your drama. And your opponent is probably sipping tea and composing a sonnet about your poor negotiation skills. So how did Bedouins settle disputes? With elegance, with subtlety, and with the kind of poetic sass that would make Shakespeare blush. First rule of desert diplomacy: never argue on an empty stomach. Before any serious discussion, tea was served. Strong, sweet, and scalding enough to melt tension. 3 cups minimum. 1 for peace, 1 for honesty, 1 for pretending you're not still mad. Then came the poetry. Bedouins didn't yell, they recited. If you were insulted, it was in verse. If you wanted revenge, you rhymed it. And if you lost the argument, you at least gained a new stanza for your memoir. Example: he speaks like a goat in a thunderstorm, yet claims wisdom like a date with no pit. Translation: he's loud, confused, and full of nonsense. Arguments were rarely direct. Instead, they were layered with metaphor, historical references, and the occasional camel-based analogy, like, his tent is large, but his shade is small, which meant he's flashy but useless. And then there was camel placement. If someone parked their camel too close to your tent, it was a statement. If they tied it facing away, it was shade. If they let it graze near your prized shrub, it was war. But most disputes ended peacefully, because in the desert, you needed each other. You needed help finding water. You needed someone to laugh at your jokes. And you definitely needed someone to hold your camel while you fixed your sandal. So diplomacy was an art, a dance, a slow, tea-fueled negotiation, wrapped in poetry and passive-aggressive hospitality. And if all else failed, you hosted a feast. Because nothing says, "Let us forget our feud," like roasted lamb and a dessert made entirely of dates and forgiveness. Every now and then, the desert stopped being serious. The sun took a break. The camels relaxed their judgmental stares. And the Bedouins threw a party, not just any party, an oasis party, where the water was real, the music was loud, and the goats were surprisingly ambitious. It began with arrival. Caravans rolled in like VIP guests. Tents popped up faster than gossip. And someone always brought way too many dates, claiming, therefore sharing, but secretly hoping no one liked dates. Musicians tuned their instruments, lutes, drums, and something that looked suspiciously like a repurposed cooking pot. The rhythm was infectious. Even the camels swayed, though they claimed it was just a breeze. Dancers twirled. Poets recited verses about love, loss, and the mysterious disappearance of someone's sandal. Children ran wild. Elders nodded wisely while secretly pocketing extra sweets. And then came the goat contest. Yes, it was real. Yes, it was competitive. Each family brought their finest goat groomed, perfumed, and occasionally bribed with figs. The goats were judged on elegance of trot beard fluffiness, ability to ignore humans with regal disdain. One year, a goat named Majnuna stole the show. She trotted in, wearing a flower crown. She refused to walk in a straight line. She headbutted the judge's tent, and somehow she won. She was crowned Queen of the Oasis, a title she held with pride and mild confusion. Her reign lasted 3 hours, during which she ate the ceremonial garland and knocked over the tea table. The party continued into the night. Lanterns glowed, stories flowed, and someone inevitably tried to ride a camel backwards for the vibes. It was joyful. It was chaotic. It was the kind of celebration that made you forget the desert's harshness and remember its heart. And as the stars blinked overhead, the Bedouins curled up in their tents, full of laughter, music, and goat-related memories. The desert is quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hear things, like whispers, or the sound of your sandal slowly disappearing into the sand. Bedouin folklore is full of ghosts, not the spooky, chain-rattling kind, more like passive-aggressive spirits with a flair for drama. They didn't haunt you, they inconvenienced you. Take the tale of al-Ramal, the mother of sand. She was said to drift across dunes at night, rearranging them just enough to make you question your memory. You'd swear your tent was next to that rock. Now it's next to a different rock, and your camel is judging you. Then there was the whisperer, a spirit who mimicked voices. You'd hear your cousin calling, "Come this way." You'd follow, and end up at a shrub that looked like it wanted to fight you. Most desert ghosts didn't appear. They suggested, they nudged, they made you second-guess your decisions, your directions, and occasionally your fashion choices. But the most infamous tale, the vanishing sandals. It began one night when a traveler named Farid woke up to find his sandals missing. He searched everywhere, under rugs, inside his camel's personal space, even in the teapot. Nothing. He asked around. Everyone denied involvement. except one old woman who whispered, "The dunes have feet too." Over the years, more sandals vanished, always at night, always without a trace. Some blamed mischievous spirits, others blamed bored goats. One man blamed his own forgetfulness and started tying his sandals to his beard. The legend grew. People began offering tiny sandal-shaped charms to appease the spirits. Some wore mismatched shoes on purpose, claiming it confused the ghosts. And one clever merchant sold ghost-proof slippers, which were just regular slippers with a dramatic backstory. But here's the truth. Whether real or imagined, desert ghosts gave people something to talk about, something to laugh about, something to blame when they misplaced their dignity or their dinner. And as the wind howled and the stars blinked, the Bedouins slept soundly, knowing that if their sandals vanished again, well, at least they had a good story. Love in the desert is complicated, especially when you have two humps and a tendency to spit when nervous. Camels, despite their reputation for aloofness and questionable hygiene, are surprisingly romantic in their own crunchy, sand-covered way. Courtship begins with grunting, not just any grunt, a deep, soulful, slightly wheezy sound that says, "Hey, I noticed you chewing that shrub, respect." Male camels puff out their cheeks, literally. They inflate a pink, fleshy sac from their mouth called a dullah. It flaps around like a balloon at a birthday party no one asked for, and somehow it works. The female camel, unimpressed but curious, continues grazing. This is her version of playing hard to get. She may glance sideways, she may pretend not to notice, she may kick him gently in the shin. If she's interested, she grunt back. If she's really interested, she let him share her shade. And in camel terms, that's basically a marriage proposal. There's also neck rubbing, a slow, deliberate nuzzle that says, "I like your fur texture," followed by synchronized chewing, which is either romantic or just coincidental. Camels don't rush love. They take their time. They flirt with subtlety. They express affection through proximity, shared water troughs, and the occasional dramatic sigh. And when two camels fall in love, it's quiet, it's enduring. It's full of long walks across dunes and mutual appreciation of thorny plants. Bedouins watched these rituals with amusement. They told stories of legendary camel couples, like Zara and Majnun, who once walked 40 kilometers just to graze under the same tree, or Faisal and Lulu, whose love was so strong they refused to be separated, Devon during a sandstorm and a minor tent fire. So yes, camel courtship is strange. It's noisy, it's awkward, it's oddly poetic. And if you ever hear a grunt in the desert night, just know, somewhere out there, love is blooming, one hoof at a time. In the desert, hospitality isn't optional, it's sacred, it's serious, and it's occasionally exhausting, especially when your guest arrives with 3 camels, a cousin, and a mysterious jar labeled for emergencies. Bedouin tent etiquette was a masterclass in grace under pressure. You didn't just host, you performed hospitality, like a Broadway show, but with more tea and fewer jazz hands. Step 1, the welcome. Guests were greeted with smiles, handshakes, and a dramatic flourish of the tent flap, even if you were mid-nap, even if you were arguing with your goat. You stood up and said, "Welcome," like you meant it. Step 2, the tea, always served immediately, strong enough to wake the ancestors, sweet enough to cause philosophical debates about sugar ratios. 3 cups minimum, 1 for friendship, 1 for storytelling, 1 for pretending you're not silently judging their camel's haircut. Step 3, seating. Guests were given the best spot, the fluffiest cushion, the least suspicious rug, even if it meant you sat on a folded saddle and pretended it was ergonomic. Step 4. Conversation. Light at first. Weather, camels, the scandalous incident at last week's Oasis party. Then deeper topics, poetry, politics, and whether sand has feelings. Step 5. Food. You fed your guest like they hadn't eaten since the last lunar eclipse. Dates, bread, meat, if you were feeling generous. And if they said, "Oh no, I couldn't possibly," you ignored them and served more. Step 6. Boundaries. Tricky. Guests could stay for hours, days, occasionally weeks, and you couldn't ask them to leave. But you could start sweeping around them, or loudly mention how your camel misses its personal space. Step 7. Departure. When the guest finally left, you walked them out. You complimented their camel. You gave them a snack for the road. And you whispered, "May your tent always face the breeze," which was desert code for "please don't come back tomorrow." Hosting was an art, a ritual, a test of patience, generosity, and your ability to smile while someone accidentally sits on your heirloom cushion. But it was also beautiful, because in the desert, sharing meant surviving, and every guest was a chance to swap stories, sip tea, and remember that kindness is the softest shade in a harsh world. The desert may look quiet, still, peaceful, but beneath that calm exterior lies a world of fierce competition, questionable athleticism, and one very fast lizard. Welcome to the Great Sand Games, held whenever boredom struck hard enough to make someone say, "What if we raced goats?" Event 1. Camel sprinting. Not as fast as it sounds. Camels are majestic, yes, but they run like they're contemplating life choices. Still, the crowd cheered, mostly because someone brought snacks. Event 2. Tent assembly speed trials. 2 teams, 1 pile of fabric, 1 windstorm. The goal: build a tent before it flies away or becomes a modern art installation. Event 3. Competitive tea drinking. Not about speed, about style. Contestants were judged on sip elegance, sugar stirring technique, ability to look wise while holding a tiny cup. The reigning champion, Auntie Salma, once drank 12 cups without blinking. She claimed it was for hydration. Others suspected sorcery. Event 4. Sand sculpting. Categories included camel but make it abstract, famous dunes, reimagined goat with emotional depth. Judges were notoriously biased toward anything that included a dramatic backstory. Event 5. The lizard chase. Ah yes, the stuff of legend. It began in 1989 when a particularly smug desert lizard darted through camp during lunch. Someone shouted, "Catch it." Everyone ran. The lizard zigzagged. People tripped over rugs. A camel panicked and joined in. The chase lasted 47 minutes. The lizard won. It was later spotted sunbathing on a rock, looking victorious. Bonus event: shade sitting. Participants sat in the shade and did absolutely nothing, judged on posture, stillness, and ability to ignore responsibilities. It was the most popular event and the most competitive. The Sand Games weren't about medals. They were about laughter, community, and proving that even in the harshest terrain, humans will find a way to turn survival into sport. And as the sun dipped low and the last teacup was raised, the Bedouins smiled, because in the desert, fun is a necessity, and every lizard deserves its moment of glory. You might think the desert is all dust and practicality, but once a year, the Bedouins proved otherwise. They turned dunes into catwalks, tents into dressing rooms, and camels into reluctant supermodels. Welcome to Desert Fashion Week, where the fabrics flow, the turbans twirl, and someone always forgets which way the wind is blowing. Opening night, a dramatic sunset, lanterns glowing, and Auntie Zainab strutting in a robe so embroidered it could be seen from space. She claimed it was casual. It weighed 14 kilograms. The collections, sandstorm chic, billowing robes in neutral tones, perfect for blending in or making a dramatic exit. Oasis elegance, turquoise, mint, and date brown ensembles, inspired by hydration and dessert. Camel couture, accessories made from ethically shed camel fur, including a scarf that doubled as a blanket and a statement piece called the hump bag. Turbans were the stars, layered, twisted, stacked so high they required structural support. One man wore a turban with built-in shade. Another had one that played music. No one asked how. Jewelry sparkled. Silver anklets, gold nose rings, bracelets that jingled with every judgmental glance, and one necklace made entirely of date pits, which doubled as emergency snacks. Footwear was experimental. Sandals with tassels, boots made from goat leather and ambition, and one bold designer introduced barefoot minimalism, which was just barefoot. Then came the camel. Her name was Layla. She wore a custom robe. She walked the runway sideways. She paused to chew dramatically, and when the crowd applauded, she sneezed. It was iconic. Asterisk, asterisk, backstage drama included. Desert Fashion Week may have looked serene from the dunes, but behind the tent flaps, it was chaos. Glamorous, sand-covered chaos. Backstage was a battlefield. Robes tangled, turbans toppled. Someone spilled tea on the embroidery and blamed it on a rogue breeze. Designers argued over thread colors. Models argued over camel assignments, and one ambitious goat kept sneaking into the accessories tent, chewing on tassels like they were gourmet snacks. The biggest scandal: the missing turban. It belonged to Youssef the Dramatic, a man known for his flair, his eyeliner, and his 12-layer head wrap that doubled as a weather forecasting device. One moment it was there perched atop a cushion like royalty. The next, gone. Suspects included Auntie Zainab, who claimed she accidentally sat on it, the camel Layla, who was seen sniffing suspiciously, a rival designer named Farid, who said, "I would never steal. I simply borrow with style." The search was intense. Tents were overturned, lanterns inspected, even the sand was interrogated. Eventually, the turban was found, wrapped around a teapot. No one knew how. No one asked. Youssef declared it a metaphor and wore it anyway. Other backstage dramas included a robe that unraveled mid-strut, revealing a surprisingly confident goat herder, a sandal mix-up that led to two models swapping identities, a spontaneous poetry duel between two stylists over the correct shade of sunset beige. And yet, despite the chaos, the show went on. Robes were fluffed, turbans were retwirled, camels were bribed with figs, because in the desert, drama is just part of the charm, and every fashion disaster becomes a story, a legend, a bedtime tale whispered under the stars. The desert was quiet again. The tents were packed, the camels were napping, and the last lantern flickered like it knew the story was ending. Around the final campfire, the Bedouins gathered, not for a feast, not for fashion, but for stories, old ones, new ones, some true, some suspiciously embellished. Auntie Zainab began with a tale about a goat who once predicted rain. Yusef, the dramatic, followed with a poem about lost sandals and found love. Even Layla, the camel, made an appearance, chewing thoughtfully, as if she too had something to say. The stars blinked overhead, the fire crackled, and the tea was poured strong, sweet, and sleepy. They remembered the Oasis party, the lizard chase, the Fashion Week fiasco, the ghost who rearranged dunes just to mess with people. They laughed, they sighed, they leaned back on cushions that smelled faintly of cardamom and nostalgia. And as the night deepened, the stories slowed, voices softened, heads nodded. Someone whispered, "Tell one more." So they did. A story about a traveler who wandered the desert, collecting tales, not gold, not fame, just stories. He listened to camels. He argued with goats. He drank tea with poets and danced with shadows. And when he finally settled by a campfire, he told every tale he'd gathered, one by one, until the stars leaned in to listen. The Bedouins smiled, because they knew that traveler was all of them, and all of us, wandering through life, collecting moments, turning them into bedtime magic. The fire dimmed. The last cup was emptied, and the desert, ever dramatic, sighed a warm breeze across the sand. Sleep came gently, wrapped in robes of memory, tucked in by stories, and kissed good night by the stars.